Kia ora and welcome along to this Rainbow Walk Tour. My name's Gareth.
I'm Roger.
And together we're...
Roger and Gareth.
Or Gareth and Roger.
You prefer.
Welcome along to this live stream of one of our walk tours. This is the first time we've done a live stream of Rainbow LGBTI walk tour. We started the tours in 2017, but because of the COVID-19 situation, we can't offer the tours physically at the moment. And so we thought, well, actually, another way of offering the tours and building community is to do these virtually via the internet. So welcome.
Welcome.
Now, we are using quite an old computer, and so we're not actually logged into YouTube, so we're not sure if you're there or not. We know it's streaming, but we're not sure who the viewers are. So you're more than welcome to send us an email to walks@taonga.nz. The email address is down the bottom of the screen there. Please feel free to send us an email if you'd like to contribute anything to the tour. And yes, sometimes the streaming quality is not so good, so just make sure that you're set on to the highest resolution possible. For us, because of our slow computer, I think that's at 480p on the YouTube screen.
Great. Well, first of all, we should thank you for tuning in, but also Dr. Alison Laurie and Hugh Young, whose research we draw on quite a bit for this walk tour, so thanks to them.
Well, let's start the tour off now. This will take around about an hour. The tour starts in Wellington, New Zealand.
So what that looks like from the air is coming up. There we go, satellite shot of Wellington, New Zealand, and the yellow dot is Tiaro, the business centre really of Wellington, and that's where this walk tour takes place, pretty much entirely within the suburb of Tiaro. Now Tiaro means the facing, and was thought to have been named by the local iwi, that's Ngāti Awa, in reference to facing Mount Taranaki from where they'd travelled. Maori settlements dominated Wellington up until the arrival in 1840 of the UK-based New Zealand Company, and the company's objective was the systematic colonisation of New Zealand. They began dividing up the land for European settlement. So Tiaro was one of the early areas settled in Wellington because of its flatness. And the collection of historic buildings from this area date from the 1860s. Well, this is our first stop here, the yellow dot. This building here dates from a little later, from about 1901. For its first 4 decades, it was a dry cleaning business, and then it had a variety of occupants, including in the 1970s, when the ground floor became Carmen's curio shop. Now, Carmen was a performer, a sex worker, an entrepreneur, as well as being an activist, particularly around anti-discrimination causes and HIV/AIDS. Here's a great photo of her, titled Kiwi Carmen, taken in the early 1960s. Now, Carmen was born in 1936 in Taumarunui and later lived in both Auckland and Wellington. She first began drag performance while doing compulsory military service, and that might sound a little strange, military service and drag, but in the New Zealand Defence Force there was a rich history of female impersonators. For instance, the Kiwi Concert Party entertained Allied troops in the Middle East, Italy and in the Pacific during World War II. And here's Ralph Dyer, also known as Marlena Heatrash, performing for the troops in New Caledonia. And there are a number of other performers that would still have been talked about when Carmen joined the military in the 1950s. Well, after military service, Carmen moved to Sydney's King's Cross and became Australia's first Maori drag performer, and from that time she self-identified as transsexual. In 1967 she returned to Wellington, where she established her international coffee lounge, Le Balcon Cabaret, an Egyptian tea room, a massage parlour and a brothel. And she also established this curio shop. Now here's a great photo of Carmen's home in Sydney years later, but it shows you that curios and collecting knickknacks was part of her life.
Well, one of Carmen's many achievements was winning a landmark court case in 1966, which was about the right to wear female clothing in public. Now, prior to 1966, newspapers from New Zealand are peppered with stories about people being taken to court for just simply that, wearing female clothing in public. On the 9th of January 1966, Carmen was arrested in Auckland and charged with behaving in, quote, an offensive manner. And the offensive manner was that Carmen was wearing a black frock, silk stockings and high-heeled shoes. But Carmen wasn't having a bar of this. She said that she was going to go to court and defend the charge, which she did. So she turned up at court, but the police asked her to go home and dress in male clothing, and she refused, saying that she had been caught as a woman and she'll go to court as a woman. Well, the judgment came down from Justice McCarthy, who said that not only was he dismissing the court case, but, quote, he was quite unable to find anything in our law which says that it's unlawful for a male to attire himself in female clothing. And that was a really watershed moment here in New Zealand. That was in January 1966. So Carmen not only was a trailblazer, but also fought for things like homosexual law reform, prostitution law reform. So homosexual law reform happened in 1985, 1986 here in New Zealand, and prostitution law reform happened in 2003. Well, we're going to talk a wee bit more about prostitution law reform at our next stop, which is literally just 2 steps down the road. So we're currently at the red dot, and we're going to the yellow dot. And the yellow dot looks like this when you look at Street View.
So this was the first location of the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, who opened a centre here in October 1988. Now the collective formed in 1987, and it was formed by a diverse group of sex industry workers with the aim of providing support and education. Shortly after forming, they were contracted by the Ministry of Health to provide a range of services focusing on HIV/AIDS prevention. Now the collective shared this space with the National People Living with AIDS Union, sorry about that, which was based here from 1988 to the early 1990s. This was also the home of Wellington's first needle exchange program. Now right from the start, the collective was a driving force for prostitution law reform, and that call was taken up by Labour MP Tim Barnett, who introduced the Prostitution Reform Bill into Parliament in 2000. Now the purpose of law reform was to enable sex workers to have access to the same protection afforded to workers in other industries. In June 2003, New Zealand became the first country in the world to decriminalise sex work. Now prior to this, sex work hadn't been explicitly illegal, but there were a range of offences that could be committed in association with acts of prostitution, and these were policed and prosecuted. For example, from 1908 onwards, a person who kept a common bawdy house for the purposes of prostitution, along with its tenants, was liable for 2 years' imprisonment with hard labour.
Well, surprise, surprise, even though prostitution was illegal, it still happened, sometimes quietly and then sometimes blatantly as well. And a really good example of that is Carmen's International Coffee Lounge, which was on Vivian Street. And it was actually right next door to the Salvation Army Citadel, which makes this interesting companions on the street. It was a 2-storey place, and on the ground floor was the coffee shop, and then upstairs they had bedrooms for sex work. Now, the clients were, they had a cup and saucer routine that they would do, so Carmen knew whether they wanted to meet up. So they'd come in, they'd have their cup of tea or cup of coffee, and then a cup, let me just make sure I get this right. A cup upside down was for a heterosexual liaison, a cup on its side was for a transgender liaison, and a saucer placed on top of a cup was for a homosexual liaison. And so she was catering to a wide range of tastes. Apparently Carmen had a great line that she used for male patrons that were giving her a bit of stick. she would say, "Do you want a fuck or a fight? I can give you both." That kind of like sums it up really, really well, doesn't it? Yeah. Just before we move on, let's just take a look at that building one more time. So the outside of this building, so where the yellow dot is, that was built in 1920, but behind it is one of the oldest cottages, the oldest buildings in the Cuba Street area, which dates from 1860. And we've got an image here. It was put on the market, on the residential market, a few years ago. And so this is this little two-story cottage. Cuba Street is actually on the other side of the cottage, so we're actually looking towards Cuba Street. But it's a really nice little hidden gem on the top of Cuba Street. We're going to move to our next stop now, which is literally just across the road. So we're at the red dot and we're going to go to the yellow dot, and in between that is the motorway bypass, and so we're just heading northwards a little bit.
So if we look at the building where the yellow dot is there, that's a great example of the work of the architects Thomas Turnbull and his son William, who were significant Wellington architects in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, this is how the building looked originally, and it's on the other side of the road to where it is now. It was a commercial building, and when they put the bypass through, as well as destroying a great deal of the heritage of that part of Wellington, they did take some buildings apart and move them, and this is one of them. It was a commercial building.
And one of the really interesting things here is that to the left of that double-story building you've got just that single story, and if we flip it to an image from today, so the building on the left was actually originally on the right, and where that yellow dot is where those single-story buildings are. And that yellow dot also represents where Carmen's Egyptian tea room used to be.
Well, across the road from where we are there, that back to the commercial building, William Turnbull, who designed it along with his father, also built this next building, majestic home, on Bowen Street for Alexander Turnbull. Now you might be thinking, aha, William Turnbull, was he at all related to Alexander Turnbull? Well, in fact, the families weren't related.
You may also be going, aha, or because Alexander Turnbull, who the house was built for, looked like this, very Dashing is the word, man.
Dapper.
And now Alexander Turnbull was a merchant here in Wellington and a book collector. So he was born in Wellington in 1868, but moved to London with his family in 1875. But he actually returned here in his early 20s, which was quite interesting. In 1915, Turnbull House was built as his residence, and also as a place to store his large collection of books. Unfortunately, a couple of years after Turnbull House was built, Alexander died after complications from a sinus operation, and he passed away in 1918. But before he passed away, he bequeathed his entire book collection, his entire collection, to the nation, and this becomes the first national collection for our National Library. So there were over 55,000 books, manuscripts, photographs, maps, a whole range of things, and that now forms the basis of the Alexander Turnbull Library, which is part of the National Library here in Wellington. Now, in early gay circles, apparently Alexander was known as, quote, a screaming queen, but we have no evidence. I'm not quite sure what evidence you'd need to be a screaming queen, but apparently nothing else has been found.
He never married. That's good enough. Moving right along.
Moving right along. So we're going to go down a wee bit further down Cuba Street now, and so we're at the red dot, and we're heading northwards to the yellow dot, and the yellow dot is actually where the People's Palace used to be. So the People's Palace is now the hotel building on the right. It's a 4-story building, and there's a bit of a better shot of it. So the People's Palace was built by the Salvation Army, and it was there to provide liquor-free, cheap accommodation for working class people, families and travellers. And from the facade there are a number of points where it was constructed. 1904, which I think is on the furthest left, it's the kind of smallest part of the building, then 1916, and then in 2003 it was given a bit of a facelift. Again, by that time it was a hotel. Now, the reason for the People's Palace, these were buildings that were built in both New Zealand and Australia, was, quote, to assist the fallen and suffering brothers and sisters and to rescue outcasts. Well, before the People's Palace on that same location, the Salvation Army had the Paulina Rescue Home, and that was built in 1894. And if we had been at the Paulina Rescue Home in 1894, we would probably have come across this person, if I can just bring up the slide, which I think we've skipped. Here we are. This is Eugene Fellini, and this is actually a police mugshot of Eugene.
Well, the fact that there is a mugshot of Eugene hints at some of the history we're going to talk about with Eugene. Eugene was born in Italy in 1875, came to New Zealand at the age of 2 with his family. He was the eldest of 22 children, 17 of whom survived into adulthood. Now, Eugene was working at Murphy's Brickworks in Taranaki Street when he was taken to court for impersonating a man. Around 1895, he ran away to sea, aged 21, and was raped multiple times by the ship's captain and had a baby in Sydney in 1898. Now, staying in Sydney and changing his name to Harry Crawford, he married twice, and he was charged and subsequently convicted of murdering one of those wives in 1920. Now, the evidence for the murder conviction was circumstantial, and by today's standards it looks far from compelling. And Eugene died in 1938 after being released from prison and stepping off the pavement and accidentally into the path of an oncoming car.
I just had an email in, and just sort of say a big, huge hello to Andrew. Andrew, who has been quite on a number of our walk tours, and it's been really lovely having you on those tours, and it's lovely having you here now. So thank you so much for tuning in. Again, if you would like to say hello, we're not actually logged into YouTube because we've got quite a slow computer
for technical reasons.
But you're more than welcome to send us an email to walks@taonga.nz, and we'll pick it up from there. We're just going to head round the corner a wee bit. The People's Palace is on the red dot, and we're actually heading to the yellow dot, which is very close by. And currently in Wellington, this is called Ombra. But it was actually called the Morgans Building, and it was built in 1922. Now here's an image from the 1970s, and I'll just point out a couple of things. Firstly, the Janus hairstylists on the ground floor, that was actually Anthony Janus, who began his long occupancy there in 1937. If you're from Wellington, you may know the name George Janus, and George Janus is a hairdresser, salon owner, has been for decades in Wellington, and has had numerous salons. Well, George started here in 1953, so that's a long history for hairdressing. And my goodness, you know, with the current COVID lockdown, looking forward to the looking forward to the hairdresser.
COVID here.
Oh, go back to the image. Okay, so The other thing was the striptease sign down the side of the building, which has been there, had been there for a long period of time.
Yeah.
In the 1970s, it was advertising Club Exotic, which was later renamed Club Exotique, just to give it a bit of a twist.
Well, Club Exotique was owned by Emmanuel Papadopoulos, and the famous New Zealand actor and percussionist Bruno Lawrence worked for a time at the Club Exotique, and he accompanied strippers with drum rolls and fanfares. Carmen worked here too in the 1960s, and from the mid-1970s, Georgina Bayer worked here. And there's a great interview with Georgina from a few years ago where she says, "The only queens that got work in the clubs and do the full-on stripping had to be extraordinarily good-looking and unspringable. The exploitation was horrendous in lots of ways, but better to be inside the club on a cold, wet, windy night than stuck out on a corner trying to pick up a client." And in another quote she says, "I'd finished doing a spot up at the Club Exotic, race downstairs in my bra and panties and perhaps with a fabulous cape on and sort of fly across Vivian Street to get to the Purple Onion to fill in and do a spot there." Well, now the Purple Onion was Wellington's first drag club. It was located just next to where the Subway shop is now on Vivian Street.
Well, Georgina Bayer's life has been an amazing journey, continues to be an amazing journey. Here's Georgina in the 1990s. So Georgina was born in Wellington in 1957. She lived in various parts of the region before moving with her mother and brother to Auckland. While in Auckland at high school, she began acting and realised this was a career she really wanted. So she won the College Cup for Drama in 1972, and then at the age of 16 left high school. She moved back to Wellington and worked around the kind of Cuba Street area in both the sex and entertainment industries. In the 1980s, she won, or was nominated in the National Film and Television Awards for Best Actress in a Dramatic Role. And then in the 1990s, she moved into politics. So 1995, she was elected the Mayor of Carterton District. And so this is an image from that time period. The Carterton District is just north of Wellington. The really fantastic thing with this appointment was that Georgina became the first openly transgender person in the world to hold a mayoralty. And then in 1999 she moved into national politics and she became a Member of Parliament. And again, this was a world first, the first openly transgender Member of Parliament in the world. So, among other things, Georgina fought for prostitution law reform, and she also fought for civil unions and gender identity legislation. So, a real trailblazer, and yeah, it's fantastic to be able to celebrate her. Before we leave this location, there is just one other thing that we should point out, and that is in 2016, the Mayor Celia Wade-Brown really pushed for our pedestrian traffic lights here in Wellington to have icons on them. And in Cuba Street, the person that is celebrated is Carmen Rupe, and here's an image of Carmen's traffic light. So if you go to a number of the traffic lights on Cuba Street, when the traffic light for pedestrians turns green, you get this wonderful icon of Carmen. So we're going to move to our next stop now, which is just around the corner. So we're going from the red dot to the yellow dot. So that's kind of going east way. And we are going towards a service station. And just a note, this next story is talking about a local hate crime, which can be a bit graphic.
Well, in the early morning of the 8th of May 1999, 14-year-old Jeff Whittington was sitting on the curb of this petrol station. Now, he's had a night out, he's drunk and he's high. At 4:20 a.m, a police officer talks to Jeff. Jeff says he's okay, and so the officer leaves. But also out drinking that night were two men in their 20s, Stephen Smith and Jason Meads. Now, by chance they drive past Jeff here at the petrol station. He's a complete stranger to them. The two men stop the car and start talking to Jeff. All three eventually wind up a short drive away in Aro Valley to smoke a joint, and it's here that Stephen and Jason beat Jeff to death. Now, the pair later boast to acquaintances that they've beaten up a faggot who'd been wearing makeup. Well, they tell their acquaintances that they've never seen anyone bleed from the places that he bled from. Stephen and Jason admit punching and kicking him, but they deny stomping on his head and say they never meant to kill him. Well, Jeff suffers severe brain damage, has boot marks on his skin, and has a ruptured bowel. A woman finds him alone lying in a puddle at 4:40 a.m, and the next day he dies in hospital. Now, the jury convicts both Stephen and Jason of murder, and they're sentenced to life imprisonment. Jason is released from prison in 2013, and Stephen is freed on parole in April 2017. Each time he's been released, on 3 previous occasions, he's been recalled to prison.
Well, the murder happened just 8 months after the very high-profile killing in the US in Wyoming of Matthew Shepard. And both killings had a real dramatic effect on many people, including local playwright Ronald Trefero Nelson. And Ronald subsequently wrote the play Corner 4 AM and Cuba about Jeff, and it was premiered at Bats Theatre in Wellington in 2007. Now, Bats Theatre is a really small, intimate theatre in Wellington. Really, it's a beautiful theatre, but can only hold around 100 people around that type, that size. And in an interview a few years ago, Ronald was saying that for that season, both Jeff's family and the perpetrator's family attended the production, and just how it must have been such a tense night of theatre. But really fantastic for Ronald to be able to document that, and we still remember Jeff. Mm. Okay, we're going along now to our next stop, and I'll just bring up where our next stop is. So again, we're at the red dot, and we're going eastwards towards the yellow dot, and the yellow dot being St. Peter's on Willis Street. And here is a recent-ish photo of St. Peter's on Willis Street. So St. Peter's was built in 1879. The building we're looking at now was built in 1879, and it was by Thomas Turnbull, who we've talked about earlier in terms of the architecture. However, there was an earlier church of St. Peter's on the same site, built in 1847, and so we're talking just 7 years after European settlement happened in Wellington. And here's an image of the old church. So the part on the right hand side was actually added in 1866, so the original part of the church is on the left hand side. So almost immediately when this church was built, it was used as a temporary accommodation following the 1848 earthquake in Marlborough. It was a huge earthquake. It was about 7.4 on the Richter scale. But by the 1870s, the church had seen lots of modifications, and had been described as, by the 1870s, as, quote, a large, straggling, disproportionate, shapeless, hideous deformity. And so a replacement church was planned, and this is where we get St. Peter's, how it looks today.
Well, the main reason we're standing here is that in June 1967, the Reverend Godfrey Wilson delivered a sermon highlighting the negative treatment of homosexuals. Now, it's a radical call for acceptance and inclusion at that time. Now, remembering this is almost 20 years before homosexual law reform in New Zealand, which happened in the mid-1980s, and many people at the time would have thought homosexuality as a perversion and certainly not a matter for human rights. Now, there's a clipping here from about the same time. Detective Superintendent F.A. Gordon, or if you like acronyms, that's FAG, asks people in Christchurch, do we want our cities overrun with pimps, ponces, pansies, pussyfoots and perverts? Well, the answer today might be yes to that question, but then in the 60s the answer was a resounding no. Now, Redfern Godfrey's sympathetic sermon was broadcast live on national radio, and it was probably the first sermon of its kind in New Zealand. The core of the sermon was about a man named John, and he's visited by a prison chaplain. Now, John works in a bank, but he's now in prison because of his homosexuality. John says to the chaplain, "If you fall in love and marry, well, that's fine. But if I fall in love and want to share it, that's perversion and must be persecuted and punished." So in 2017, the service was repeated to mark the 50th anniversary of that landmark 1967 church service. This time it was taken by the Reverend Annette Cater, who at the end blessed the rainbow banners in the church, which included the one that she had made from materials given to her by her mother, who makes clergy vestments. Now, Reverend Cater's blessing was, "We know that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and all that is in it. And God said, 'It is good,' all of it. And so, in that spirit, may these banners be a symbol of that all-encompassing, generous, amazing, unending love for all, that all who see it may be overwhelmed by the power of that love and know, God, that you are a God of love."
If you do get a chance, St. Peter's on Willis Street is such a beautiful church to go into. It's lovely and ornate and lovely wood finishings. Yeah, really lovely. So we're just going to move to our next stop now, and our next stop is we're at the red dot, which is St. Peter's, and we're just heading northwards a wee bit down Willis Street, and what we're coming to is what used to be called Baptist House. And here on this slide it's called Strategy House, but it's just this four-storey building here. So as I say, it used to be called Baptist House back in the day, and apparently Russian sailors would come here often and pick up Bibles, because there was a Bible store at the base of the building. But nowadays there are a variety of occupants. On the second floor we've got the Lilac Lesbian Lending Library, and then on the first floor we've got the New Zealand AIDS Foundation Awhina Centre. So this was not the first location of the Awhina Centre, that was in Newtown, but this is where Awhina has been since 2008. The Awhina Centre was the second HIV/AIDS centre clinic in New Zealand, the first being the Burnett Centre in Auckland. And the reason it was called the Burnett Centre was because of Bruce Burnett, who we've pictured here. So Bruce was born in New Zealand but was living overseas in the 1970s and early 80s. He returned to Auckland from San Francisco in 1983, and the next year he began a one-person road trip around the country trying to educate people on AIDS. In Palmerston North, he came out publicly as somebody who had AIDS, and that was incredibly courageous, because at the time there was a lot of stigma, discrimination, misinformation. So for example, things like, if you share food with someone, or if you use the same swimming baths as someone, you might catch AIDS, and just total nonsense. And this is stuff that Bruce was having to deal with, and not only was he dealing with it personally, but he was coming out and being on TV. There's quite a lot of media coverage of Bruce talking about AIDS. Just to give you a wee bit of background, in 1981 the CDC first put out some reports about some young gay men dying in the US, but it wasn't until 1984 in New Zealand that we had our first AIDS-related death. So we're probably about 3 or 4 years, 2 to 3 years later than what was happening in the US. But at that time there was no government organisation that was doing prevention work around HIV or AIDS, and so Bruce came along and started doing this one-person road trip around New Zealand. Now, at the same time, Bruce, along with quite a number of other people, started formulating the AIDS Support Network, which was a community-based response to HIV/AIDS in New Zealand. And they set up a whole network throughout the country, looking at all aspects of support. So, you know, physical support, emotional support. It was based on the Shanty Project in San Francisco, which was had been established years earlier. So Bruce kept on working pretty much until his death. He died on the 1st of June 1985, and he stopped work just a couple of weeks before that. But this year marks the 35th anniversary of Bruce's death. So within 18 months of Bruce dying, the AIDS Support Network had gained government funding and had kind of transitioned into the New Zealand AIDS Foundation, and this is the birth of the New Zealand AIDS Foundation. Just quickly back to Lilac as well. So Lilac, which is on the second floor of this building in Willis Street, is the largest accessible collection of lesbian books in the country, which is really fantastic. It's been going since 1994 and is completely volunteer-led and run. What an amazing resource, and to have it going for that length of time is really amazing as well. Okay, so we are going to head a bit further down Willis Street now, and we are at the red dot, and we're going to the yellow dot, which is actually the Willis Street Village.
So the village was designed by Roger Walker and built in 1979. It was the fourth and final location for the Dorian Society, and it occupied a space that you can't quite see from this angle, at the back of the building there, shortly after the village opened, and it continued there until 1988. The Dorian Society was established in 1962, and it was the first New Zealand organisation for homosexual men, although homosexuality wasn't mentioned in the club rules or minutes. Now, the objective was to promote among its members an honest desire to serve the development of friendship, mutual respect and tolerance in all its aspects. And it was primarily a private social club that avoided political action, but in 1963 it took the first steps in New Zealand towards law reform by forming a legal subcommittee that collected books and other resources. This led to the formation of the New Zealand Homosexual Law Reform Society. Well, the Dorian had a number of locations around Wellington, including on Lambton Quay by Cable Car Lane, and it had an all-male policy for some time. Lesbians weren't accepted as members or even visitors at the beginning, but by the time it was here in the Willis Street Village, it was open to all. Now, the Willis Street Village was also the site of Outrage, which was a lesbian-owned private club in Wellington, operating from 1991 until 1993. Let's walk to our second to last stop.
Virtual walk.
Virtual walk. Walk virtually.
The exercise is great, isn't
That's
it?
great. It's doing me a lot of good, as you can see.
Okay, so we're walking from the Willis Street Village in red up a wee bit up to Bulcott Street, so the yellow dot. And so this is the intersection of Willis and Manners. And this is a bit of a better view. So where that yellow dot is now where the Majestic Tower is, and it's kind of opposite St Mary's Church. And there are two things we're looking at. One is the Pollen House, which is the lovely wooden building on the corner, but that had actually been moved down to that corner. It was originally a bit further up the street, so we'll get to that in a minute. And the other one we're looking at is Bulcott Chambers, and Bulcott Chambers here is on the right, and on the left we've got the Pollen House, so they kind of sat side by side together. The reason why we're talking about Bulcott Chambers is because it was a real hive of activity for rainbow activism in the 70s and 80s. Now, it was the site of the Women's Resource Centre, the Hecate Women's Health Collective. On the third floor was the Lesbian Centre, which was the first of its kind in New Zealand, and that opened in November 1980. And also on the third floor was the Lesbian and Gay Rights Resource Centre. And the real purpose of the resource centre was, it was a hub, but it was also a place where information was gathered and disseminated. So human rights, censorship, health, homosexual law reform really brought all this information together and was a real hub. So it was a hub for activists, but it was also a target for arsonists. And the centre was targeted twice with arson, firstly in October 1985, and that was during homosexual law reform, and the second time was on the 11th of September 1986, and so that's after law reform had passed, but there were still obviously some people that didn't particularly like it. And this image is a David Hinley image, and it shows Phil Parkinson looking through the aftermath of the 11th of September arson attack. The arsonist was never found.
Well, just as we saw in that photo just before, just uphill next door to Bulcott Chambers was what was known as the Pollen House. A couple of years after law reform, the site was cleared for the Majestic Centre, and the house was moved down to the corner of Bulcott and Willis Streets there, and it was rotated 90 degrees, and that's the situation that we find it in today. Now this image here is from 1988, and it was while the land was being cleared around it. Dr. Pollen's house was his home and surgery. He actually died there in 1918 after contracting influenza during the pandemic that swept through New Zealand at that time. Now, he was the Wellington Port Health Inspector, and he got the virus while inspecting overseas ships in Wellington Harbour. Now, his wife Catherine had died in 1894, and he lived at his house here with his two daughters, Dorothy and Effie. Effie was born in 1879 and is mainly remembered these days for her long-term relationship with the famous New Zealand poet Ursula Bethel, which lasted for over 30 years. Here's a great photo of Bethel with cat.
Very large cat.
Very large cat. So the two met in London in 1905, and they lived overseas for many years, not returning to New Zealand until they were in their 40s. Now, when Pollen returns to New Zealand, Bethel follows, and there's a suggestion that for some time they lived together in the Pollen house. But what is certain is that by 1919 they were living together in Christchurch at Rise Cottage, and here's a great image of the interior of Rise Cottage. Now, Effie kept house and supported Ursula so that she could write, and in fact Bethel wrote most of her poetry during this period, describing their home, garden and life together. Now, Bethel called Pollen her little raven. But even though they lived together, they were at pains to travel separately on public transport so as not to arouse suspicion. While guarding their privacy, they did invite friends to visit, including members of the rainbow community, people like artist Tos Wollaston, poet Charles Brash and Walter Darcy Cresswell. Now, a few days after Bethel's 60th birthday, Pollen complained of severe headaches and went to bed, and sadly died there 3 weeks later of a brain hemorrhage. Now, the distraught Bethel wrote openly of her grief for Pollen in letters and in the 6 memorial poems that were composed on the anniversaries of Pollen's death. In the 6th and final poem, Spring 1940, she asks God to match spring with vision, spirit of beauty, bring with your persuasive love to the inward eye awakening, lest, looking on this life to count what time has taken, I cannot bear the pain. Well, Effie is buried in Karori Cemetery, and Ursula, rather sadly, is buried in North Canterbury.
Just before we move on from this area, there was just one small thing we really wanted to show you, which was here, where If we move from the red dot to the yellow dot, so that's Perrott's Corner, so you can see the Pollen House on the left-hand side at the red dot, going to the right dot on the yellow side. This is really interesting because when we started putting this tour together, we came across this wonderful image from 1860s of this location, and I'll just bring it up on screen now. So the yellow dot on this image is the same as the location of the yellow dot on this image. So we're looking at Perrott's Corner on the right hand side. The Majestic Centre is actually where the kind of cart is. Sorry, actually that'd be where the Pollen House is now, and the Majestic Centre is just a bit back towards us. The really interesting thing here is if you're from Wellington, you'll know that there's quite a lot of development that is things like the City Gallery, Civic Square, the Michael Fowler Centre, is all happening to the kind of north and west of us, which in this photograph is water. So we are very close to the waterfront. We're only 1 block away from the waterfront when we're standing on Perrott's Corner. And it's just really interesting to think about all the land reclamation that's happened in Wellington. All of those buildings, actually quite a number of those buildings are now closed because of earthquake risk, aren't they?
Ah, yes. What does that tell you?
Well, it's not very stable land. It's actually not. It's probably not land at all, is it? It's repurposed. But yes, so that's a very interesting photograph from the 1860s. We're going to move now to our very last stop for this tour, and we're on the red dot, which is Perrott's Corner, and we're going to the corner of Manners Street and Victoria Street and the yellow dot. And the building we are going to talk about is now where the Amazon Surf Let's Ride building is.
But back in the day, on this corner, we would have found one of Henry Britton's pharmacies. Now, Britton had moved from Auckland to Wellington in the early 1870s with his family, and he established a pharmacy on Lambton Quay, and then purchased the Tiaro Dispensary in 1876. The dispensary was affectionately known as the Pillbox because of its unique octagonal shaped construction, and we can't see many of them. We can see 3 of those 8 sides here in this image, and as you can see from the site itself, just on the corner there, it's at least triangular, if not 6-sided, and maybe we could get a couple more sides to make it octagonal. Anyway, if we had popped in here for a medicinal remedy back in the day, we would probably have spoken to a young Robert Gant, who was Britton's apprentice for 4 years before moving to Masterton in 1882. Now, Robert Gant loves photography and theatre, and he has a long career as a female impersonator, taking the stage name Cecil Riverton. Now, here's Cecil on the right. The Evening Post even declared Cecil as achieving a pronounced success in the part of Little Buttercup in the 1881 production of HMS Pinafore.
But it's, I think, probably Robert's photography from the late 1800s which really resonates with us today. So Robert's visual interests included young men, sailors, shoes, execution scenarios. So at the time, we're talking 1880s, they were really kind of into beheadings as a theatrical kind of scenario. Device, yeah. But have a look at these images. So this one's from 1888, and this is around the Masterton area. So we're just talking north of Wellington, and Robert is in the middle, and he obviously as well took the photograph. And then there's this one, which is pretty unambiguous, and Robert is on the left, and he's not wearing the hat. Just amazing to think this is rural New Zealand, 1880s, 1890s. Then there's this image, or these images, and this is Charlie Hay. And Charlie was the son of a butcher, of Greytown's butcher, and this is when he was 20 years old. And so not only did Robert photograph Charlie, but they struck up a relationship, and they moved back to Wellington around 1908 and lived together for over 25 years in Seatoun, the suburb in Wellington. Now, the really lovely thing is that these images, which are in two photographic albums, exist because when Robert died, Charlie got the albums, and then the Hay family, Charlie's family, held on to those albums and deposited them with the Alexander Turnbull Library a few years ago. And when you think of all the times that these albums, these photographs could have been destroyed, they could have been thrown out, they could have been burnt, and yet they weren't. You know, they survived. They, you know, right from the 1880s when Robert took them right through to today. And you can still see the albums, and you can actually physically go and look at the albums at the Alexander Turnbull Library, which is quite remarkable. Robert's life has been documented in a really lovely book by Chris Brickell. It's called Manly Affections and was put out in 2012. And that's our final tour stop.
We've done it.
We've done it. Thank you so much for watching. This is our first attempt at doing a kind of virtual tour, and as we've said earlier, that if you have any suggestions, please feel free to write to us at the email address walks@taonga.nz, which is on the bottom of the screen. Through COVID-19, we are unable to do these tours physically, but really hope that doing these online gives a real sense of community, but also gives a chance for people that haven't been able to see these tours a chance to see them and also contribute as well. So we're doing our next tour on Sunday the 7th of June, so it's the first Sunday in June, 1 o'clock, and it's going to be the Violet Tour, which goes from Parliament onto the terrace and then down to the waterfront. So really hope you can join us then. This tour, even though it's live, will also be available online, so so you can watch it at any other time as well.
Great. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for joining. Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.